Hi, my name is Eli Kranzberg, and welcome to this series on Logic's new MIDI effects plugins. We're going to have a ball. I'm going to show you how the controls work, and we're going to try and look at some nice creative applications and uses for some of these. Now, by means of introduction, I want to start off with a question I'm often asked by surprisingly experienced Logic users. I'm often asked, what's the difference between a MIDI plugin and a regular audio effects plugin? Because MIDI plugins are new for us Logic users. 3 points I want to make here that distinguish the difference between audio and MIDI. The first one, and the most important in terms of understanding the differences, is that MIDI plugins, first of all, are inserted in software instrument channel strips, not audio channel strips, not auxiliary channel strips, only software instrument channel strips. And they process or generate MIDI data. So they don't actually process or affect the sound of the audio. It's got to do with MIDI data. They process or generate MIDI data, either played from a region that's playing back on the track or from a MIDI keyboard live in real time. And what's great is that the transport doesn't need to be running. So we have a software instrument, we either play on our keyboard or have a region here, and the data in that region is processed by the MIDI plugin, the actual note data or controller data. The second point is that MIDI plugins are connected in series before the audio path of a software instrument channel strip. So here I have 3 different MIDI plugins inserted, and they're all happening before the sound is going to be processed by any potential audio plugins on the channel strip. So the note data gets processed by these, and then the sound is processed by audio plugins. And the third point, in order to understand specifically how these work and what they do, is that MIDI plugins have 3 stages. There's a MIDI input stage. In other words, they respond to MIDI input either from what's on the track or what they're receiving from the keyboard. The second stage is that there's a MIDI processor, so it receives this data and then it processes it with whatever specific functions that plugin does. And the third stage is that it outputs the MIDI data. So it listens to what's coming in, it processes it, and then it sends out MIDI data that's based on the processed information. And the output signals sent from these plugins are all standard MIDI events. They're standard MIDI messages like note messages or controller messages. So just to summarize real quick here, number 1, MIDI plugins are inserted on software instrument channel strips, and they process or generate MIDI data either based on what's playing back on a region or what they're receiving from keyboard or MIDI input. Number 2, MIDI plugins work in series. In other words, this second one is being affected by what's done by the first, and this third one is being affected by what's being done by the first 2. They operate in series, and they come before the audio path in the channel strip. And number 3, they respond to MIDI input, and then they process that MIDI input, and then they output MIDI output, meaning MIDI note or controller messages. And finally, a little bit of different plugin insert behavior here in Logic Pro X I just want to draw your attention to. These plugins have 3 hotspots. We can bypass on the left. We single click in the middle to call up the plugin interface. And the third one is where we click to either select a plugin or change plugins. And if we want to swap positions, we don't need to hold a modifier anymore. We can just click and drag and move them around and swap them like that. And if we click right underneath the last one in the zone on the right here, we can then choose an additional plugin. So that's a little intro. Next video, we're going to jump in and start looking at the note repeater.